Hey, I'm here with Tim Capel and Josh Hefner, and they're music attorneys or entertainment attorneys.
Either one.
Okay. And they work for a firm here in Nashville called Farmer, Purcell, White, and Lassiter, and that's where we're at today here in their wonderful conference room. And thank you guys
Absolutely.
Thanks for having
for
us.
allowing us to come in and answer some questions.
Happy to do it.
Help everybody out. You want to just tell a little bit about yourselves?
Yeah, I have been practicing in the area of music and entertainment law for around 10 years now. And I divide my time between New Orleans and Nashville. The office is here in Nashville, and I also teach in the music industry program down in New Orleans at Loyola University. So during the school year, I spent a good amount of time there as well. But we represent everywhere from aspiring or emerging artists, independent artists, all the way to artists on major labels in all different genres. So we have the benefit of seeing deals from a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different genres and different ways that different cities, whether it's New York or Los Angeles or Nashville, kind of conduct business. We're really fortunate to be able to see things from a lot of different angles.
I am also from Louisiana. I just recently moved up to Nashville in December, so new to these parts. I went to Loyola. Tim was actually a professor of mine at the law school, and joined the firm in September. And also a musician. Play drums in a band called Royal Teeth. It's like alternative pop stuff. So, I'm fortunate to be able to relate to a lot of the artists we work with, and kind of know what they're going through. And we're a very active touring band, so I get both sides of that, and it's been helpful as we kind of go out and get clients and work with emerging artists.
Are you going to plug your new record?
I would, but we don't have a release date, so it's a little too early.
Round Hill Records, Royal Teeth,
yes.
Release to be determined.
Late fall. We'll go with late fall.
All right.
Cool. Okay, I guess I'll jump in. I have some questions that I got from some people in our group,
Yeah.
and just some other stuff that I kind of put together. One of the biggest issues I see come up is with collaborations, which is, I guess, the cool way to call it joint work. We just say collab, especially in the pop world. So
That is cool.
yeah, that's cooler than
Like how you
joint. It's not
shorten
like,
that.
hey, you want to do a joint work with me?
Yeah,
Like,
let's do a collab.
so
Write that down. You never use that word.
So a lot of times a producer will make a track and then an artist will top line it. They'll write the lyrics on their own and the melody or with the producer. And then issues a lot of times come up if the track's not used or the song's not used. Can that track be taken and used for something else? And at what point is there joint ownership of the song and the sound recording? As two separate things.
Yeah.
And when should there be a contract in place? Because usually when you get together with somebody to collab, you're like, hey, you want to hang out and maybe work on something, and it's supposed to be a little more natural than like, hey, let's get together and do a joint work and sign some contracts and get it going.
Yeah.
So. Well, I think there's a lot to sort of unpack there, but the first let's take determining splits as sort of the first thing. I think the important thing to remember is that there really is no right way to do this. There are customs that I see that in different genres, right? So if you're a rock band, rock bands, at least more recently, have tended to start sharing the love and giving the drummer and the bassist, and no offense to drummers, but I mean, when I was active playing music, I didn't necessarily think of what the drummer was doing as a composer, as a composer of the song. The truth is that there's really copyright law has very little to say about it. It's really up to the individuals that are involved to determine what constitutes creativity to that song. distinguishing it from the recording. I think everybody agrees. It's usually not a hard thing for bands to agree with that once you get in the studio and you record a song, that recording is split equally amongst the people who participate in the recording process. When it comes to songs, it's always a little bit more tricky, and you can look back over in history and see a lot of different ways that people have done it, right? So I mean, in the Beatles, it was Lennon and McCartney, right? They weren't sharing with Ringo and George. It just didn't happen. The odd part about that relationship is most people probably know that very frequently they were writing alone, but then giving each other credit for the songs that they had written alone. Then you have a band like Green Day, and Green Day has always shared from the start. Coldplay is another example of this, where they have always split songwriting credit equally. And I think most people would probably acknowledge that, a Billy Joe Armstrong is the primary songwriting force behind Green Day's songs. Or put another way, their drummer is not really, part of the quote-unquote songwriting process. But they chose from an early stage that was the way that they were going to do it. Neither is right, neither is wrong. I think the most important thing to do is surround yourself, if you're in a band, the most important thing to do is surround yourself with other creators, other musicians who share the same concept of a song. What does it mean to be a song? Is the bass part a part of the composition? Are the drums a part of the composition? And if so, then everybody's going to split. But there are some people who believe that, no, when I sit down and I write a song on the piano or the guitar, that's the song. And anything you add after that, the bass, the drums, guitar licks or what have you, that's not the song. That's not really legally correct. That you can't say one way or the other that this is for certain part of the song and that is for certain not part of the song. So that's why it's really important for people to surround yourself with collaborators who view things in the same way. And then when you get, but in the hip hop world or the pop world, there's really no, the creation process is somewhat simplified. And that although there may be a lot of hands in the pot, there's really no argument that the people who are involved are not songwriters, right? Because if you're adding something to the beat, if you're creating part of that beat, nobody's going to argue, oh, well, you're not a songwriter. And clearly, the lyricist is the easiest person to say, oh, of course that's part of the song. So you don't really run into those issues so much about who's a songwriter and who's not in the pop and hip hop world. But what you do run into are the splits issues and how do we split this up? There again, there's no right way to do it. There is a default way, which is if you say nothing, you don't have an agreement amongst the collaborators. What copyright law is going to do is going to hand you an agreement and say everybody splits equally. Right? So I hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, well, the maker of the beat gets 50%. So if there's two producers that are creating the beat, they're each going to get 25, and the top line lyricist is going to get the other 50%." And I have people come into these other crazy scenarios that they'll swear by, right? These formulas. They say, well, if you write the hook, you get 25%. And if you write, a verse, you get 10% per verse. None of that makes any sense. I mean, it makes sense up here to them. And it may be a logical way to split up a copyright. But what copyright law says is that if there are 5 people that are determined to be authors, then each one of them is going to get 20%. I don't care what you did. Even if your contribution was relatively minor, they don't care, right? So even if you and I get together and collaborate, and you may offer some changes to a verse, right, of my country song, at the point that it's determined you cross that threshold into becoming a joint author, we're now 50-50 authors. Even if you numerically or mathematically only contributed, say, 5% or 10%, now you own 50%. So it's really important to understand that baseline foundation, which is it will be split equally unless you say something. And that's where the rub comes in. So I don't know if what your experience is like in dealing with these issues as a member of a band. But
I mean, it's different. I mean, when we go in, the band, there's 4 of us. We split everything evenly. And that's not because we write evenly. It's because at the beginning we decided like we all have our own role here. And because we all have our own role, I do the tour managing, I do the legal work. I don't do as much writing, but because of that, I'm not compensated for that financially, so we compensate each other with songwriting credit. So we do it that way amongst ourselves. When we get in a room to do a co-write, we've had some people that will lay it out in a little easy email, like let's just split this thing evenly when we go in, sounds great. That's enough, to at least get the ball rolling. Some people will decide after. We'll see like, okay, how much did you contribute? Was this an idea that the band already had together and you kind of came in and changed a few melodies, and we've kind of negotiated those things after the fact. But, again, I mean, you take the risk of losing leverage at that point when it's already created, you're already in the room and you're already, the song's written. If you don't have anything in writing and somebody, only contributed what you view as 5%, but you don't have anything in writing, it's like, all right, no, they're going to get an equal share. So I've seen it both ways. The sad fact is that oftentimes I'd say often, the song could be out and you still haven't figured these things out, and
I've had that happen with collaborative stuff, and somebody will say, "Oh, we never discussed any of this."
right.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, and then one time there were 3 of us on the right, and one person didn't contribute very much or didn't come back the second time.
Yeah.
And the artist was like, "Hey, this person should get a lower percent." And I was like, I don't think he should, but he went along with it just to not.
Well, and
make
that's
a
the second
problem,
part of your
so-
question, right? Is what we've been talking about is what does it mean to be an author, right? The Copyright Act talks about authorship, right? And unfortunately, the Copyright Act doesn't define what it means to be an author, but yet this joint work, the full title is joint work of authorship, right? And so to pick that apart, you have to say, okay, well, what does it mean to be an author? And that's what we've been talking about in terms of contributions, right? And so generally, if you look at like case law and the way you have to have contributed to the creative process in order to be deemed an author. One of the things that I'm constantly reminding people, mostly on the sound recording side, is that money doesn't equal authorship, right? So just because you paid for something to be created doesn't mean you own it, right? So that's usually not an issue on the composition side, but it is an issue on the sound recording side where people are putting up money and they naturally feel like, well, I paid for this, right? Or it comes up in music videos a lot too, as well, right? Where I'll have clients be like, pulling their hair out saying, well, I paid for this video, why don't I own it? I say, well, because you have to separate out the tangible part of that, the actual video files, to the extent that you can call those tangible, from the underlying intellectual property. And money does not equal contribution, nor does it, dissolve somebody's contribution without a written agreement. The second part of your question was, well, what is a joint work, right? And like the first part of your question, there's no easy answers. When does a work become joint? Well, what the law says is that a joint work is one that is created by 2 or more authors with the intent that their contributions be merged into inseparable or interdependent parts. So what does that legal gobbledygook mean? Well, inseparable parts would be you and I get together for a co-write session and we're both actively participating in the writing of a song where, at the end of the co-writing session, you can't take my parts out from your parts, or otherwise it all falls apart at the end. But there's also this notion of being an interdependent part, and that goes to your question of producer, top-line lyricist, right? At what point do the parties intend that their 2 works, the beat and the vocals, at what point did they intend for those 2 things to be merged such that you can't pull them apart anymore? And that's a fact question. What that means is that's a really expensive question to litigate, because you're having to argue about what somebody's intent was at the time. And subjective intent is, of course, once you're in a lawsuit, you're going to say, no, of course I didn't intend for that to be merged. And then on the other side, they're going to say, of course we intended that to be merged. So you're trying to look for some sort of objective indicators of what the party's intent was. And that's really tough to do. And so we've definitely been in situations where a producer will pull back their beat, right? And they'll say, well, after the track has been completed. Now, at what point does that become a joint work, so where that producer loses the ability to pull that track back, to pull it and say, no, I don't want you to use this? I don't know. It all depends on how the sequence of events have played out. Now, as a practical matter, if somebody wanted to pull their beat, we're probably going to let them, right? Unless it's already out. If it's already out, sorry, we're not gonna pull a song just because you don't like it anymore. You had promised this beat to somebody else, or there's always some factual scenario that comes up. But we've definitely had to pull songs off a record because the producer of the beat has said, no, I don't want to do that. I promised it to somebody else or some other reason. And we just do it as a practical matter because it's not worth litigating. It's not worth the cost of litigating that. But yeah, I mean, that is the reason that you do the paperwork up front is to try and address those situations, right? And it is a difficult conversation to have. It totally ruins the vibe. I think the good thing to do is, if you start collaborating with somebody on a frequent basis, what I try and have clients do is establish some sort of written agreement that says every collaboration that we do together is going to be treated like this.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And that way you don't have to do it in the moment. What you can do is say, look, I really like writing with you. So we don't have to worry about the paperwork every time. Why don't we just come to terms on this, and everything that we do is going to be governed by this agreement? And
Well, that's probably a good idea too for projects where the producer and the artist may not even meet in person.
right,
So, like, that happens in our world a lot, where we'll find someone that lives somewhere else and like, hey, do you want to do something together? And then I'll just send them a track, or the producer will send the artist a track, and they take it from there, and then they'll send something back. I guess the intent should be made before that with the contract, or just some kind of clear statement. And if, I guess you could say, I want to see what you want to write to this track before I commit to using it, would be a good idea.
That's exactly
Instead of
right.
just saying, hey, let's do this together, and then be like, man, I love this track, I don't want to use it on this song, I don't think it's very good, and then cause a problem.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Is you can set out that expectation in the least confrontational way possible, but being clear in your intent and saying, take a swing at it. I've been holding this track for a while and trying to see, get the right fit for it. Would you like to take a stab at it? Laying something down, and let's evaluate after I hear it. That's always a possibility. It does depend on how I think largely how the transaction goes depends on whether or not, for instance, like, you're buying it, if you ever like beat leasing and stuff like that, astounds me, right? Because it's so fraught with legal issues. This idea of renting a beat for a certain number, it makes no sense legally. But if you are exchanging money, then you would be missing a very opportune moment to interject some legal foundations there, right? Because it's already become formal. It's no longer two friends doing something, or two people that are trying to be cool with each other and whatever. If there's money getting involved, no matter how little, I think at that point, everybody ought to say, okay, this is a business transaction,
Yeah.
right? And then get the business transaction out of the way and then move on to the creative aspect. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, and I feel like, I've always found the paperwork thing to be less awkward with producers, than it is for like co-writes or songwriter collaborations. But I think it's because of that. Producers usually require some sort of upfront fee. You're talking about points. It's just more accepted to kind of say like, hey, we gotta address this first. For songwriters, there's usually no upfront fee. You kind of just get in a room and you're gonna, it's like more of a back end thing. And so I guess that is like one difference, that it makes it a little more uncomfortable in those songwriting situations than it does the producer situation. But at the end of the day, I think it can be real simple for the compositions, for the songwriters. It doesn't have to be a big drawn out contract. It can be an email. It can be on a written piece of paper to just establish the guidelines. And then, if you need to flush it out later, then, you do that. But you really don't. Songwriting split sheets can be, one page, very simple.
Most of the ones that I try and keep them to one page,
Yeah.
2 at max. And the only time they would ever extend it into 2 pages is when you're dealing with the administration of the recordings, or the administrations of the song, rather. So under copyright law, after you're just, not only does copyright law say, okay, well, if you don't have an agreement to the contrary, everybody's going to split equally. But then once you have that joint work, each author can make independent use of 100% of the work. Meaning, so if you own 50% and I own 50%, that doesn't mean that I can't do anything without your permission, and vice versa, right? We can do anything with the song without the permission of the other author, except grant an exclusive license. Right? That's the only limitation that copyright law says. And that makes sense, right? Because an exclusive license means to the exclusion of you as well, right? So apart from an exclusive license, which you don't run into a lot, if you're talking about a sync license, mechanical license, those sorts of exploitations, none of those are exclusive in nature, right? So you can do a whole lot of damage. Preparation of derivative works would be another, right? So I could take the song and remix it without your consent, and all of the, so that is why the one-page split sheet doesn't work sometimes, where it just has the percentages. And that's where a lot of times, for most of my clients, I have I'm really uneasy, particularly with unpublished clients, right? So if you're collaborating with somebody doesn't have a third-party publisher, then that's when it becomes really important. And the reason for that is, if the work is ultimately going to be owned by a third-party publisher, if the 3 of us are all signed, and each, yes, I'm going to get a third, and you're each going to get a third. Ultimately, I don't own that because I'm under contract with the publisher, and the publisher's going to own it. Well, the publishers have this unwritten rule that nobody touches the other's share, right? And that doesn't need to be in contract. It's really sort of a mutually assured destruction kind of thing. Like nobody wants another publisher administering or exploiting a composition without their consent. And so they, as a courtesy and as a matter of custom, they will not do it either. But where it really comes into play is when there is no publisher involved, no third-party publisher, and so that threat of mutually assured destruction is no longer there. And you have unpublished writers who are more than happy to go out and create a remix, and are more than happy to license it to a film for below market rate or whatever it is. They don't need your consent to do anything like that. And that's where I think you have and this, if I was better at writing, I could probably keep this at one page, depending on the number of songwriters. But all you have is a simple clause in there that says no party will have the right to administer and exploit the other party's interest in the composition. So here's what the shares are going to be, and we all agree that the administration will have to be joint. That before anyone does anything with it, you have to get permission. Now, the only caveat to that is where, say, I'm representing an artist who is bringing in some outside songwriters to participate in that process. At that point, representing the artist, songwriter, I want the artist to have complete administrative control, because I don't want to give, Tom, Dick, and Harry over here the right to prevent my artist client from putting the song on the record, or for landing a sync or something. And also, it's not even just that, but it's a matter of timing, right? If somebody comes to me looking for a sync license, I want to be able to turn that around. Basically, they want to know, hey, can you grant this license based on 100%? And that's a fancy way of saying, do you own everything, or do you have the rights to administer everything? And that's what music supervisors are looking for. They love 100% songs, because they don't have to make all these stops and get consent from him or her, And so if you're an artist and you are planning on putting out this song yourself, you may want to consider having the right to administer the composition as it's embodied on that recording. So you can't go make use of the composition for all purposes, but at least if somebody wants to use that song as it's embodied on your recording, you have the right to say yes or no. So if it sounds complicated, it is a little bit, but ultimately, once you get it right once, you'll know how to do it over and over and over again. That's why I think you come to us. People come to us once, and we love establishing long-term relationships with artists and songwriters. But of course, that doesn't always happen. Sometimes people will come to us and say, "Hey, I need something that I can reuse," and they get a contract from us, and then they reuse it over and over and over again. And that's part of the reason why, is because really and truly, once you get it done right the first time, you shouldn't have to be going back to the lawyer's office saying, "Hey, I need this again." So that is an incredibly long answer to your. I told you we had to unpack it.